I'm Bill Haltom, and today is June 26, 2002. We're in Memphis today to interview Mr. Louis R. Donaldson III. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Good morning, Mr. Donaldson.
Good morning.
Let's just start off. Why don't you tell our viewers who you are and when you were born, and we'll talk about your family.
Well, I'm Louis Randolph Donaldson III. I was born on October the 9th, 1917.
Tell us about your parents.
Well, my father was a food broker. He worked in a business all of his life that my grandfather, had started in 1881. And my grandfather bought a flour mill about 1900, and he got out of the business, and my father ran it the rest of more or less the rest of his life. My brother's in the business still. My grandfather was born in Nashville and came to Memphis. Well, he lived in Memphis for a good bit while he was a boy, then went back to Nashville, finished high school, and came to Memphis in about 1876. And so we've been here, the family, ever since that time. Of course, the Donaldsons had been in Tennessee for forever. My great-great-great-grandfather, John Donaldson, was surveying in Tennessee in the 1760s, and in 1779 and 80, he along with James Robertson, was the founder of Nashville, and took the famous trip down the Tennessee and down the Haltom and the Tennessee and up the Ohio and the Cumberland to bringing the women and children on flatboats. And he left a log of the journey, which is very fascinating. And of course, when they got to the Ohio, everything was upstream after that, and they were poling. There was no other means of locomotion, shall we say. And my great-great-grandfather and his sister Rachel were both about young teenagers. They were the principal polers, the stronger members of the group at the time. A very, very interesting trip. And so we've been in Tennessee for a long time. That boy who helped come down the river and all was a lawyer, passed the bar in Tennessee, became a lawyer in Tennessee. You didn't have bar exams in those days. You studied in the lawyer's court, then you appeared before the court and they questioned you and you admitted. In 1796, which is the year that Tennessee was admitted to the Union. He died young, leaving some small children, and one of them was my great-grandfather, who went to live with his aunt, Rachel Jackson, and they raised him. His name was Andrew Jackson Donaldson.
Well, I was going to ask you about your family's relationship to Andrew Jackson.
Well, as I say, he was, of course, Rachel's nephew. She had no children of her own. The adopted son was a first cousin of my great-grandfather's. They always referred to my great-grandfather as their foster son, and the number of letters from Jackson referring to him in that way, and even in the will he refers to him that way. So that he lived there with them. Had a funny thing happen to me. I'd always visualized, my great-grandfather going up there in the Hermitage. And we were up there a year or so ago, and we were looking at that cabin around the back, and they were saying, now this is the first Hermitage. And I had heard that before, but then she said, now, the Jacksons lived here from 1803 to 1821. And I turned to Jed and said, this is where my great-grandfather was raised. He wasn't raised in that big house up there. He's raised in this log cabin back here. But in any event, he had a close and wonderful relationship with him. And of course, when Rachel died before Jackson took office, he and his wife went to Washington and lived with Jackson the whole 8 years he was president. And my grandfather had 2 sisters and a brother who were born in the White House.
Wow.
Very unusual. So that's sort of my family background. Andrew Jackson Donaldson was a lawyer, but he never really practiced. He went to West Point, and then he went to Transylvania Law School up in Kentucky. And but he spent, up until 1845, he spent his life mostly as Jackson's aide, and was appointed by Jackson to be, well, he was appointed by Tyler at Jackson's urging to be the minister plenipotentiary to Texas to negotiate the annexation. Very fascinating. Took him 3 days by boat, I believe it was, or 4, to get from New Orleans to Port Washington on the Brazos, which was the capital of Texas at that time. And we have letters to the family, writing mostly back to Andrew Jackson about what was going on.
I assume you grew up hearing these stories about your heritage.
I did, growing up hearing about them. And my grandfather was a trustee of the Hermitage, and my father was a trustee, and my brother was a trustee of the Hermitage, and I'm now the chairman of the National Advisory Board of the Hermitage. So we had all that connection in the family. And of course, my great-grandfather's home is now part of the Hermitage property. It's called Tulip Grove, and I guess you'd say it's next door to the Hermitage. It's actually about a half a mile away. But
when you were a boy, Mr. Donaldson, who was the principal family historian? Where did you hear most of these stories about your family?
You know, really, I heard most of them from my grandmother, who wasn't a Donaldson. My grandfather died when I was about 8 or 9. I was 8, and I never heard any stories from him. But I heard a lot of stories from my grandmother. And her father was a Tennessee Supreme Court judge, and her uncle was a chancellor up in Nashville as well. I love to, when I go to the courthouse up there, I do love to see the pictures on the wall.
Tell me their names.
McAllister, and of course my grandmother's nephew was Hill McAllister, who was governor in the 30s. So we've had a long connection in Tennessee. Then on my mother's side, why my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side was A.O.P. Nicholson, who was United States Senator and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Tennessee. And one of my wonderful stories, one of my former partners who's deceased was Longstreet High School. And Longstreet told me this story. He said, "Do you know about the connection between your family and mine?" I said, "No, I don't." I said, "I just know when I was in college, I used to drive my grandmother out to see your mother." And he said, "Oh, no, that's not the connection at all." He said, "My grandfather was Joe High School. He was a young Confederate officer who was captured and sent to a prison camp, and your great-great-grandfather, Nicholson, was in the prison camp because they'd taken him hostage when they captured Columbia. On a wicked behavior of the town. They became friends, and according to my grandfather, and this is what he told me himself, he said, I said to Senator Nicholson, "What are you going to do when the war's over?" He said, "Well, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get a pardon, because I was served in the Senate with Andrew Johnson, and he'll get me the pardon." And sure enough, that did happen. And then he said, "I'm going to run for the Supreme Court, and I'll be elected, and I'll be made Chief Justice." And he said, "Well, how about making me Attorney General?" And that's what they did.
Incredible.
Great story. So anyway, I have that background and heritage in the law, but my father was not a lawyer, my grandfather was not a lawyer, my grandfather on my mother's side not a lawyer, my father. So I haven't had any lawyers in a few generations. Judge Martin was the principal person who got me interested in the law. At that time, he was not a judge. He was just a cousin, shall we say. His name was John Donaldson Martin. The Martins and Donaldsons intermarried in 3 successive generations. So we have whole lots of Martin Donaldsons and Donaldson Martins and so on and so forth. But he was a lawyer, and he was president of the Southern League. I was about 12, and I said, you know, Daddy, maybe if I went down to visit Cousin John, he would give me some baseball tickets.
So in the Southern League, you meant the Southern Baseball
Southern
League.
Baseball League. And so hey, Daddy took me down there. He was in the Union Plans Bank building, and I spent the day with him. Judge Mott was wonderful to me. I had known him before, but he was just wonderful. He took me down to court. We motion day, and he argued a motion, and we got all through, and the court said, I want a memorandum on this. And he said, now, one of the cases that the other side decided I'm not familiar with, said we got to go and look it up. So he takes me in and shows me how we look up the case, and then we both read the case, and we go back to the court and back to his office, and he dictates a memorandum in response, and so on and so forth. And I just had a fascinating day. Spent the whole day with him, just wonderful. And when I got home at night, he picked me up and said, "Well, did you get any baseball tickets?" I said, "No, I forgot to ask him, but I'm going to be a lawyer."
So
I'll never change that.
Your road to being a lawyer started in pursuit of some Memphis Chicks baseball tickets?
That's exactly right.
Now, were the Chicks playing in old Russwood then?
Oh, they were playing in old Rushwood.
Uh-huh.
I was actually there the last day, was the day that it burned.
Easter Sunday of
Yeah,
1960 or
that's
something
right.
like that. Now, I'm just interested because I'm a baseball fan as well as a lawyer fan. So your uncle was a practicing lawyer, but he was president of the Southern
It was a
Baseball
part-time
League.
job, just mostly, it didn't pay part anything. It was kind of mostly honorary. But he was, he was president for a number of years.
I want to get back to that about your inspiration through the baseball tickets to becoming a lawyer, but I want to ask you too, before then, when you were a boy growing up, hearing these stories about this marvelous family history, did you see your destiny in life to be in public service in some fashion?
I
or
don't
another?
really think I did at that time. I was interested in the stories. I've always been interested in the stories. My grandmother told me stories about Senator McAllister, Justice Nicholson, and I was, one of those is perfectly wonderful, so I can't bear not to tell it. She said my one most vivid memory of my own grandfather was I used to spend a lot of time in Columbia, and in those days the court would meet at noon, and he would stay in Columbia and get up and catch the train and go to Nashville and go to the court, and the court would convene at noon, so give everybody time to get there. And said I was playing around one day, and he wore a stovepipe hat, and I put a dandelion chain around the hat. Well, he got up that morning, it was wintertime, and it was completely dark. Put the hat on, walked down to the train station, because he's a very dignified old man. Everybody was afraid to say anything to him. So he gets on the train, rides on the train, gets off, walks to the court, and when he gets to the court, takes off his hat, he sees the dandelion chain. And he said he wondered why people were smiling at him that morning. Nobody dared tell him. I said, "Would you get a whipping?" He said, "Well, I got a reprimand, but I don't think I really got a whipping." Anyway, that's a great story about him.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to...
Starting with elementary school.
I started at Snowden.
And Snowden, for people outside of Memphis, Snowden is in Midtown Memphis. And
today it's on North Parkway at McLean. And it was, at that time, it was only a grammar school. It didn't have junior high, anything, only a grammar school. And at the end of the first half, I had to start in the middle of the year because they were very strict. You had to be 6 before you could start to school, and my birthday is in October, so it was February before I could start. And at the end of that, they put me up to the 2nd grade, and then at the end of the next half year, they wanted to put me up to the 3rd grade. And my father went to see the principal and said, "I don't like this, that my son's probably going to be small, and I just don't want to see him get too far ahead of his peers." And the principal said, "Well, he'll get bored." And so Daddy said, "Well, what would you do if he was your son?" He said, "I'd send him to Miss Pentecost."
And tell me who Miss Pentecost. Tell us who
Miss Pentecost ran a private boys' school. And Daddy told me he'd never heard of the school at that at that time, but he went to see Miss Pentecost, and I went over and went there from the 2nd through the 8th grade, and then went to Central for a year, and then Miss Pentecost got me a scholarship to go to Choate, and I graduated from Choate. And interesting enough, as I said, in my graduating class, the number one person in the class was Bill Dibben, who became a Nashville lawyer. He was at that time from New York, and Walter Armstrong and myself, and we finished. Bill Dibben was first in the class, and I was second. Walter was third.
So 3 future Tennessee lawyers were the top 3 students in the class at Choate.
Amazing.
When did you first hear about Choate? Was it from Miss Pentecost?
From Miss Pentecost. She admired the school greatly. I had also heard about it from Mrs. Fisher, who was the widow of Hubert Fisher, who had been the congressman from this district, and her son Adrian had gone there. And but Miss Pentecost was the main one. She had sent several boys including Walter, to Choate, and thought it was a wonderful school, and she really arranged to get me a scholarship, so I was able to go. And then I gave that scholarship to my brother, and he went.
Now, Choate is located where?
Wallingford, Connecticut. And the thing that people always want to know is that in the class ahead of me was Joe Kennedy, who was everything, president of the freshman senior class and captain of the football team, and always did very well academically. And then in the year behind me was Jack, who was undistinguished totally. I did learn later, I didn't realize at the time, that he was ill a great deal at that time. But he was in my house one year, and when I was a senior, and one of my responsibilities was to be sure that he was in study hall when he was supposed to be in his room.
You had responsibility of making sure John F. Kennedy
to check
attended
up on
study
the
hall?
people in our house. There were two seniors in each house, and I know that he always had to be in study hall, which meant his grades were not strong, shall we say. But I didn't get to know him real well, but I knew him well. My brother got to know him pretty well, played touch football with him and some other things. My brother was a year behind him. But and I just knew Joe as a BMOC. But I had great experience. Then I came back and went to Southwestern to Rhodes.
Before we talk about Southwestern, I want to ask one story I'm just anxious to ask you about your Choate experience. And this is something that I read about at some time, about an encounter you had when you were going to Choate with Boss Crump.
That's right. Well, it wasn't when it was a summer before I went to Choate.
Now, I think probably most of our viewers know about Boss Crump, but just for the benefit.
Well, Mr. Crump, of course, was a long-time political boss in Memphis. This would have been in 1932, and at that time he was serving his only time in his one term that he served in Congress. And I was going to New York rather, with my father, and we got on the train, and Mr. Crump knew Daddy, and he invited us to have dinner with him, and we really, and I was just fascinated. He was charming, and he was charming to the extent that I didn't feel like I was being treated as a little boy. I was 14, I guess, 13. Anyway, but I was in the conversation. So, of course, I'd been raised that way by my father. So, but I do have a letter that I wrote to my mother from New York, saying I met on the train the most charming man I ever met, which I thought was a good word for a 13-year-old. but anyway, it was a very interesting encounter. He was a fascinating man, and he had just an amazing way with people.
What was the quality that you saw in him that?
Well, the quality I saw in him then as a little boy was he had interesting stories, but he was also very, very, you might say, sensitive to my feelings and my interests and so on and so forth. And and made you understand in retrospect what made him such a powerful political leader, because he just had a way to persuade people and to lead people. Because of that, I have only one of the experiences with Mr. Crump. Went up to Cincinnati to argue a case, and I get on the train, there's Mr. Crump again, and he invites me to have dinner with him, and we had a delightful, wonderful evening. And at the end of the evening, he's saying, you know, Louis, Mrs. Crump, this is about just shortly before he died, probably less than a year. Mrs. Crump is tired of politics. And I said, well, why don't you quit? And he said, I can't quit. I said, what do you mean? All you have to do is say, I've had my turn. He said, oh, no. He said, there are all those people out there that have helped me over the years in various campaigns and elections. And so when they ask me to help them, I have to do that. Well, you know, I've lived long enough to understand that that's just the way it does work.
You told us earlier that the pursuit of some baseball tickets got you interested in law. Anything about this meeting with Mr. Crump or
no.
That got you interested in politics?
Not particularly. My interest in politics, I may have a little bit, but my interest in politics was really began before that, and that's why the meeting with Mr. Crump made such a big impact on me, because he was talking about things that I was very interested in, and was interested to hear about them and that sort of thing, and so I've always been. And then when I went to Choate, which is right after that, it was unbelievable, the difference between political awareness in New England and political awareness in Memphis.
How is it different?
Well, they just were up on everything. I remember one letter to my father that I was reading. I haven't looked at those letters in years, but I was saying, Daddy, everybody up here, this is in 1932, is talking about this new guy in Germany called Adolf Hitler. But they had a current events thing, and of course it was so wonderful, because when they have it, they'd have senators and congressmen and business leaders and all that would come up to Choate. And it's easy to come to, but also because it had a lot of powerful, rich connections, if you will. And so that current events club was just, I was very fascinated by that, and had two great history courses up there, in European history and American history. All of that sort of fed my interest in.
But you had that interest before you went to Choate.
But I had that interest before I went to Choate, and I would say that probably came from family stories.
Mm-hmm. When's your first recollection as a boy of really being interested in politics?
Well, I guess I thought of it more as being interested in history and family history at that time. Politics, I certainly got interested in politics when I began to hear about Andrew Jackson, stories about Jackson, and about my great-grandfather and his political activities and so on. And that would have been, well, my father was 36 when I was born. My mother was 27. They didn't think they were going to have any children. Along I came. So I was, as my father said, telling me later, he said, I was saying, you always treat me like an adult. And he was joking with me. He said, yes, and I remember when I first looked over at you in the crib, and I said, how are you, son? And you said, pretty good, Daddy. Anyway, so I was always involved, and we talked about politics and political things in the family. And although my father was never involved in politics, very interested in those things. And then we began to go to the Hermitage, when I was probably no more than 6. And you hear those stories up there. And again, my father never said I was too little to hear anything, and it wasn't so much that it was too adult. It was just it might not be interesting to me. I was always considered to be interested in those things. So it sort of very, very much began. And then as my grandmother began to tell me more and more stories, and then I began to see the first thing, you know, you have all these, first thing I had a book written by Mary Donaldson, Christmas in the White House, you know. Mm-hmm. and then, you know, I got the book about the journey down the Tennessee and so on and so forth. And all that sort of fed on my interest in history, and from my interest in history came a natural interest in politics. But that was really, I hadn't thought about the fact of the meeting with Mr. Crump, but certainly that probably spurred it. And then when I got to Choate, it was very much stirred up at that point into national affairs and international business, political questions and that sort of thing.
Your years at Choate, what years would those have been?
I graduated in '34.
Then you went to Southwestern, now Rhodes College.
Now Rhodes College.
Tell us about, first of all, why did you decide to attend Southwestern?
Well,
we'll just use the Southwestern title. How about that?
Yeah, Southwestern title. Well, I had planned to go to the University of Virginia, where my father went, and I had applied and been accepted. And my uncle became ill. And in those days, there was no safety net, and Daddy said, "Son, I'm going to have to support your uncle. And would you mind going to Southwestern for a year or so until we get this straightened out?" And I went to Southwestern and loved it and never thought about going anywhere else.
So you were at Southwestern for
4 years.
4 years. All right. So you didn't go immediately into law school after
No,
2 years as you could in those days. All right. What did you study at Southwestern?
I majored in political science. I took a lot of English. Dr. Sam Monk had been a friend of the family a little bit before I went there, and we became very good friends. And then I spent a year and a half as his assistant. I graded themes and pop quizzes for him and that sort of thing. So we became very, very good friends, and I enjoyed him very much. I studied political science originally under Siefkin, who then left and went to Emory, and then Amica, who taught there as political science for many years. And I read for distinction in political science, as they used to call it then. And you had to write pay a senior thesis, I guess you'd call it, not a dissertation, but a thesis on liberty and authority. And I got a degree with distinction in political science from Southwestern.
When you were at Southwestern, did you know at that time that you wanted to go to law school following your graduation?
Oh, yes, indeed. That was all planned before I even went to Choate.
So that all harkened back to when you were 12.
That's right. I
knew
never
that path
changed.
was set
And
at
of
that
course,
time.
I began to do other things that were, to get on debate teams and do things of that sort that would be preparing me.
Were you involved in politics at all as a student?
Well, as campus politics was not a very big deal at Southwestern. In those days, school was small, 450 about. And, we had elections and so on and so forth. I was editor of the student paper. I was president, before that I was president of the publications board, and I was, I think I was vice president of the class one year, something like that. Anyway, not a big deal, but some.
Then you set out to law school.
That's right.
And where did you attend law school?
Georgetown. And it was interesting that my uncle had then recovered, and he had married. He was over 50 when he married the first time and proceeded to promptly have a baby. And my father said, "Son, I hate to tell you this, but you can't go to Harvard. You got to go where you can work." And Senator McKellar, who was sort of a member of the family, will get you a job in Washington, and you can go to law school up there and go at night, because in Washington is the only place where they've got law schools other than New York that are accredited by the ABA that you can go at night in those days. And I went to Washington. It was really interesting. I didn't know whether I wanted to go to GW Georgetown. I had a good friend who had gone to Southwestern with me and who was, I guess, 2 years ahead of me. And he had gone to Georgetown, and he talked me into going to Georgetown. And what did I do? I had my transcript. I went down to the admissions office. I said, I want to go to law school. They said, here's my transcript. And they looked it over and said, fine, the tuition for the first semester will be $80.
This was at Georgetown.
That's right. No more than that. The diploma and a transcript, and I was in.
And did you actually go to Washington with your diploma and your transcript? I mean, that was your admissions?
Yeah, that's all I had. And I had not applied to them ahead of time. Anything. I just walked down there to the admissions office, and and they said, fine.
We're going to talk about...
can you imagine the tuition? $80.
$80.
For the first semester. That's 10 hours. $8 a semester hour.
You mentioned, I want to go back to, you mentioned Senator McKellar, and who was a Tennessee senator for decades, was he not? How long was it?
From about 1910, maybe 8, until 54.
And you said he was like a member of the family. What did you mean by that?
My aunt had married his brother, and my first cousins were his nieces, and he had no children, never married, so he was very much a member of the family. From that point, he had a number of nieces, but he was very devoted to them, and so on and so forth. So I knew him well, and then as a coincidence, I had a big tax case for South Memphis Land Company, and Senator had incorporated the company when he was a lawyer, and he'd taken stock for his fee. And so we had this big tax case, and he was very much involved. And so when I'd go to Washington to try to get the case done, I'd always visit with him. And he lived at the Mayflower, and so I got in the habit of staying at the Mayflower. I still go there. But it was really interesting because the case involved the fact that the income tax was passed on March 1, 1913. And so all assets, for purposes of income taxation, that you had owned before that time were valued as of that date. And my original partner, Alan Davis, came up with a brilliant idea. We represent the Mallory family, who were the principal stockholders of South Memphis Land Company, and that we could use that stepped-up basis for that land to make a large, shall we say, distribution from the company, or dissolve the company and have a big tax-free income. And so he went out and found a old realtor who was practicing in those days, and he gave us a wonderful affidavit about how valuable that land was, and then promptly died. It was very convenient. And they couldn't go with anybody else who was even thinking about selling real estate at that time. This was in probably 47, 48. So that was the basic answer. When we got the case won and everything else, well, the senator got this big distribution. He called me and said, "Louis, I'm going to have a mortgage budding party, and I want you to come up because you're the primary responsible for me being able to pay my mortgage." Man, that was my connection with Senator McKellar. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that your father had said that if you went to law school in Washington, at Georgetown or George Washington, that perhaps you could get a job through Senator McKellar.
Yeah.
Did you do that?
He got me a job.
What job did the senator?
I started out as a messenger with the FHA at $90 a month. Sounds terrible, but it was a pretty good job at that time.
It was $10 more than the tuition to Georgetown.
That's right, $10 more. And then I got promoted to I was making $120.
What was your job as a messenger?
I just delivered mail around in the building, and then I delivered messages around town to other things like that. Got to know the town. It was fun in a lot of ways. But I didn't work at that very long. It had a big impact on me, though, in another way, and that is because I got around everywhere. Well, when football season started, people wanted to bet on football games. And I learned very quickly that most of the people that wanted to bet knew nothing about it. And so you might say after a while I became the office bookie.
So this was, so you worked your way through Georgetown Law School as a messenger and a bookie.
And well, I got to be an ad machine jockey. It's called an accountant, but I corrected amortization schedules for the FHA. But anyway, and then in 2 years, the war was coming on, and I called my dad and said, I'm going to quit and go to school full time. And he said, well, how can you do that? I said, well, I'll save some money. And he said, save some money on $90 a month? I said, well, remember, Daddy, I'm getting $120. He said, well, I'll save some money on $120 a month. So I finally had to confess that I had accumulated $4,000 from my gambling activities. And I learned a couple of things. Barnum was right. There was a sucker born every minute. But to be a gambler, you can have no compassion.
Really?
It was, anyway.
Now, you said the war was coming on about this time while you were in law school at Georgetown.
Right.
And what years were you in law school at Georgetown?
I went there in 38 and graduated in 41.
1941.
I actually came down after 2 years. In those days, you could take the bar after 2 years of law school in Tennessee, and you also only had to have 2 years of college to take the bar. And of course, I was a little concerned because I had not done much Tennessee law, but they said, don't worry. I said, the rule is if you wear your shoes and socks and bring your fountain pen, you pass.
That's the admission required. Excuse me, not to the Tennessee bar.
That's the Tennessee bar. But anyway, that was not really, and 50% flunked.
Really? So 50% didn't wear their shoes and socks? Or was that an exaggeration, as it turned out?
Literally speaking, but it was and I had a great experience at Georgetown. It was wonderful to me, and I did extremely well. And for a little, Presbyterian kid, they could have been nicer. And I got a lot of opportunities to job offers. And, of course, I did extremely well academically, but they didn't have to.
Had you always believed you were going to come back to Tennessee?
Well,
after
yes. Judge Martin said, Louis, now you stay up there a year and work for some government agency, because you're going to have to deal with a lot of them. By that time, he was a judge in your career, and you need to learn how they think. Had an offer to work for the Truman Committee, which might have changed my whole life.
Tell us about the Truman Committee.
Well, Senator Truman was appointed head of a committee to investigate, you might say, military suppliers, and whether they were overcharging and whether we were doing it efficiently and so on and so forth. And Clark Clifford was the general counsel of the committee. And really one of the reasons, the main reason I didn't work for them was that Judge Martin said, you want to go work for an agency. And when I called him back, he said, that's not what I had in mind. But the other thing...
You mean you conferred with Judge Martin about the, about the opportunity going with the Truman Committee?
Yeah, I conferred with him back. And he said, but the other thing was that Clifford was so, I don't know, the only way he could describe it is cynical. We're going to parlay this into something really big, and said we'll all make a whole lot of money, and Truman might get to be president, and so on and so forth. And it was all about the indirect benefits that we'd get out of this, and it made you think the purpose of the committee was to make headlines and not to serve the public, And you can imagine a young lawyer that was very much. Now I met Truman. He was very nice. Didn't act that way or talk that way at all. But I did get an interview with him, but I worked for the Civil Analytics Board, which was an agency.
But most of the predictions that Clark Clifford was making to you, trying to sell you the job, came true.
They were absolutely true. Has anybody ever capitalized on them? He did.
Mm-hmm. Now, America was going to war about this time, as you graduated from law school. And I know you said you went to the Civil Aeronautics Board. Did you pursue a military option before the CAB?
Well, I had tried to get in Annapolis, so I knew that the Navy was not too. I tried to get in the Navy. I applied to Officers Candidate School. I was turned down for both of those, and then in the spring of '41, I was drafted. Took a physical and was turned down again, and.
You said you were turned down for officer candidate. This was for physical reasons.
Yeah, that's right.
And specifically, what was the reason?
And I'd had a gallbladder operation when I was 14 years old, which apparently at that time was unheard of. And the doctor who did it wrote it up in an article, for the medical journals and so on and so forth. And everybody felt that if you had that problem and I had my gallbladder removed, and they said, well, you'll be sick and you'll just be a burden on the government for the rest of your life in some VA hospital. And so, of course, I then went to work for the CAB. Very interesting thing that I did. The first day after Pearl Harbor, well, the first thing, I was there, of course, for Pearl Harbor Day. And really, we had been to lunch. We'd been down to New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and heard Peter Marshall preach, which is a real privilege. And we went there regularly while I was in law school. Came home, had lunch, then came back to turn on the Redskins football game, and on the radio. And General so-and-so reported to the office immediately. Admiral so-and-so hadn't been on. They must have read off 30 admirals and generals. And then they announced that the Japs had attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, we lived about, we were 19, 18 cute. I was up there just a couple of weeks ago, and I went by to see where we lived that day. There's still the old red brick built row house standing there. We lived very close to Japanese embassy, so I said, let's go over and see what's happening. So we went over to the Japanese embassy, and we got there before the ambassadors got back from the State Department. You remember when Hull heard about it, they were still in his office. I don't know if you remember that or not. Japanese ambassadors were in Hull's office talking to him, and they bring in this notice to him that the Japs have attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was, and of course, the Senator, Secretary Hull was a Middle Tennessee, country boy, and they say the air was blue. But in any event, the typical couple of lawyers, we were.
You say, wait, this is you and who else?
Frank Campbell.
Pardon?
Frank Campbell.
And who is Frank Campbell?
Well, he's a realtor in Memphis. He went to Southwestern with me and was with Edward Master Company for many years, and he was in law school at the time, and I had already graduated from law school. And so the crowd had gathered, and they said, well, we ought to do something about those guys and so on. So I said, typical lawyer, I said, now don't do that. I said, there's some poor guys over in Tokyo doing the same thing. And we want them to be treated nicely. We better treat these guys nicely. So everybody kind of calmed down. But then the really amazing thing was that we drove around town that night. I bought a car, which was money that I got when I graduated, and to see anti-aircraft guns on the White House and the Capitol and the other government buildings were really one of the things that memories I'll always remember. And of course the radio, as you can well imagine, Japanese sub had been sighted in the Potomac River. A German sub was seen in Chesapeake Bay. And it was just wild talk, as you can well imagine. But it was an exciting time to be there. And then the next morning, the general counsel called me in and said, the president's White House called and said they want to know if they can confiscate all of the airline planes, all the airliners. And so I went down and spent 10 days, a week at least, night and day in the Department of Justice Library, mostly reading what Lincoln did during the Civil War, which was all decided whether it was legal or not. 10 years later, the courts moved even slower than they do now. But and concluded that he could, and brought the thing back, and Welch Pogue made some corrections and asked me to look up some more stuff, and then I got it to his satisfaction.
You said Welch Pogue, and who was Mr. Pogue?
Well, he was general counsel.
Okay, he was the CAB general counsel.
Yeah, and then later became chairman of CAB, and then later started his own law firm in Washington. And his son is now the managing partner at, well, he used to be, he may have retired now, is at Jones Day. Very, very bright, able man. He said, now, Lou, you got to take this over first to some colonel over in the Air Corps. I just love this story. It is 1 week after Pearl Harbor. And I get over there, and the guard says, because everybody in security was all put on and all, well, says, no sense you're going up there because it's after 4 o'clock, and says he leaves at 4:30 and said he won't see anybody after 4. And I said, well, I've been working on this thing night and day, and they've been calling me every day from the White House to get this thing, and I said, the White House just waiting for this thing, and he said, just prescribe me if you go up there, but he won't see you. Well, sure enough, I go up there, there's this colonel, he's putting on his coat, it's about 10 after 4, but his departure time is theoretically 4:30. I'm sorry, you have to come back in the morning. Well, I give him my same spiel. He said, come back in the morning. So I had to come back in the morning, take it over to the White House, and I head to this guy, and I said, don't I know you? And he said, yes, I'm Robert Montgomery, the movie actor. And we had a delightful conversation with him. He was the president's naval aide at that time. He shortly left shortly after that and went on active duty, really active duty in the Navy. But anyway, that's one of my best CAB story.
How long were you on the CAB?
I was there
legal
from June until April the 1st, or maybe April the 15th, I guess it was, when I got another call to be drafted, and I came to Memphis, took a physical down here, and then I went to work for Judge Martin as his law clerk when I was turned down again.
Now tell us about Judge Martin. At that time,
he was on the Sixth Circuit then. He had been district judge. He loved district judge. He loved holding district court, and while I was with him, we went to 2 different places and held district court, which he loved to do. We would go up to the Sixth Circuit for 3 weeks every other month. And the court was much smaller then. I guess there were, 6, 7 judges. But had a wonderful experience with him because I had all this previous relationship and all, and he was just really treated me with this in a wonderful way, and I enjoyed that. And one interesting thing is that the first case he handed me was a case involving the tax on nightclubs and so on and so forth. And I read the case over, and I disagreed with it. And so I drew up a memo, and I took it to Judge Martin, and he said, Larry, I think you're right. He said, we'll change this memo a little bit, we'll send it to the other judge. And so the other judge agreed with us, and so we reversed the court. So he always loves to tell me. My first case, I reversed the court. But anyway, I had a wonderful experience with him. I mean, he would discuss the cases with me, and I'd write up. And I didn't write up memos on every case, but at his request, I read all the briefs on every case on which he sat.
How many other clerks did Judge Martin have at the time?
0.
But I've been told that there are some other prominent Tennessee lawyers that clerked for him. Sheptay.
Sheptay was one. Stuart McCloy was another one. Lawson Avison was another one. Golly Moses, the whole bunch of Bill Boone. Anyway,
Now, reliable sources told me that this fraternity of clerks for Judge Martin, that Judge Martin would take y'all to the Kentucky Derby every year. Is that?
Well, he didn't take us to the Kentucky Derby. He took us to Hot Springs for the races, though.
Well, maybe my source isn't so reliable after all.
He may have taken Chef Tate to the Kentucky Derby. He never took me.
I'm not going to disclose my source on the story.
But he did. We had a custom. Every year we went to Hot Springs with him for a day, and he enjoyed the horse racing and just loved it, and we had a great time.
Did you, at that time, clerking for Judge Martin, did you, were you interested in tax law at that time?
Well, I had taken some taxation and in law school, which was fairly unusual in those days. We had a wonderful professor of taxation, and I had taken legal accounting I had taken accounting at Southwestern. I went to Dr. Deal and got him to put in an accounting course.
Dr. Deal was president of Rhodes College at the time.
Southwestern at the time, and he got Ross Junkin to teach the course. And Ross told me later, he said, there was some weeks when you and your brother were ahead of me. Most weeks I was a couple of days ahead of you. But anyway, only course my brother and I ever took together. But we really did push him.
Did you ever consider getting an LLM?
I went to Georgetown and took a couple of taxation courses, graduate courses. One of them in, well, it was in statutory interpretation, and one of them in taxation. While I was working for the CAB, but I never really considered going for an LLM. Of course, those days not many people did it. As a matter of fact, the NYU Law School, the tax school, was not even in existence then. It was the first tax course, and it was started in 48 or 49.
After your year with Judge Martin, where'd you go then?
I went to Canada Russell and Turner.
Canada Russell and Turner here in Memphis.
In Memphis. It was one of the larger firms, had a wonderful practice. Canada had just blue ribbon clients, including the Union Planters Bank and Plow, but the main thing he had was 5 railroads. And that in those days, railroads were the bread and butter of law practice. And interestingly enough, I went really to sort of assist Ed Russell. But Canada's wife was a close friend of my mother's. I had not even known that, and I don't think the Colonel even knew that when he had.
The Colonel was still alive.
He's still alive and still kicking. And he took a real shine to me, and he began to keep some cases and let me help him with them. And one of my most, the Colonel loved the most was, he called me in and said, we've got this customer of the bank who got a certified check, and he gave it as a down payment on a deal. And he came to us and said he wanted to back out of the deal and he wanted us to stop payment on the check. And he said, look, I want you to figure out how we did that. We want to figure out how we could defend it because we've been sued. Well, it turned out that the guy had the check made to himself and then certified, and then he had endorsed it. And I found some old Massachusetts law and a couple of New York cases that said that the certification ran to the guy to whom the check was made payable. And I persuaded the Chancellor B. Jack. And the funny thing was, he said, we were walking down the courtroom, and I'd gone down and held, carried Colonel's books. He said, look, he said, you know a whole lot more about this case than I do. He said, I'm going to let you try it. And there I am, I've just been practicing law for, 4 or 5 months. And he said, I'll be sitting there, and said, they'll be wondering what the hell I'm going to do. And thinking about when I'm going to jump in and so on and so forth. Well, sure enough, he never said a word. He whispered in my ear a few times, but he never said a word the whole thing. And Judge B. Jack decided the case for us from the bench, and it was really. And he went back. He told everybody in the office, and by the time he told it, he never told anybody that the check was made out to them. guy who had signed the check, he said, we got the court to hold we could stop payment on a certified check. Anyway, so I had a wonderful experience with him.
Tell me, who hired you at Canada, Russell and Turner?
Well, I talked to Colonel Canada, but Ed Russell really hired me.
And what was the big package offer they made to you?
They told me they had never paid anybody anything to start, and that was true everywhere because I had applied several other places, and but they'd pay me $150, and that I could keep all the business that I brought in, 100% of it.
$150 a month.
Mm-hmm. But truthfully, because it was 1943 and there were very few young lawyers, I made, well, more than $400 every month on what I brought in myself. Junk stuff, you know. And of course I was handling all the junk stuff for the law firm as well. I mean, general sessions had just been started and, you know, all that sort of stuff. So I did all that. But
we've been going about an hour. I want to ask you this question, and then we'll take a short break. But how long did you remain at Canada, Russell and Turner?
Well, I had an offer to go back to Washington. $600 a month, junior partner in a firm, share the profits from two guys who had been with me at the CAB. And when I came back and told Colonel Canada about it, he said, Louis, I'll give you a $100 a month raise if you'll stay. Well, with a $100 a month raise, I was making close to the same as I'd be making in Washington, not knowing how much that share of the profits would amount to. And so I stayed, and then I bet less than a month later, Colonel Canada died. First bad thing that happened was that Mrs. Canada asked me to be a pallbearer, along with, you know, Mr. Plow, Vance Alexander, all these other guys, you know, and all. I was really honored and, you know, loved to get a chance to see those people. But it was a bad sign. I was barely back in the office before Ed Russell called me in and said, well, Louis, Colonel Canada gave you a raise. And I said, that's right. And he said, well, he didn't tell any of us about it. And he said, and we've been checking up on how much you've been making because I turned in everything to the firm and they reimbursed me for what I collected and so on. And said, you're actually making some more than some of our much more senior people. And we want you to give us a third of whatever you collect, and we want to take back the $100 raise. And I said, I believe I'll go on my own.
Time to move on. Well, let's take a break, and then we'll be discussing where you moved after that.
Okay.
Mr. Donaldson, before we took a break, we were talking about your departure from Canada, Russell and Turner, and I want to resume about your legal career. But before then, I just want to ask you about a very important topic that so far hasn't come up, and that's about your wife and your family. Tell us about.
Well, my wife was Colonel Canada's secretary.
Oh, really? Okay. Her name is
Janice Ost, and we met there, and then she left and went back to college, and I persuaded her to quit, and we got married. We didn't date each other until after I left.
Did you know her before you went to Canada, Russell and Turner? So you met her there.
Yeah. She's my child bride.
And where did she after you left? Where did she go back to college?
To Northwestern. She had gone 2 years to UT, and then she had come home thinking that she ought to help the war effort. And she ended up working for a law firm. She wasn't sure how that helped the war effort, but then she went back to Northwestern for a semester. And then I said, if you're going to marry me, you're going to have to marry me now.
So what year were you married?
45.
And
February 3rd of 45.
And tell us about your children.
I have 3 children, a daughter who is director of a Montessori school in Knoxville. And she's been up in Knoxville for over 30 years. And a son who is a professor of New Testament at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Austin, Texas. And a youngest daughter is a CPA, and she is a financial analyst for the U.S. Trustee in Tampa, Florida. And I have 5 grandchildren. The oldest one lives with us. The second one, these are both my oldest daughter's sons, just graduated from Rhodes, and he more or less lives with us. And my son has a son who's 17 and a daughter who's 13. And my youngest daughter has a son who's 17. He's a handicapped child that she adopted, and knowing it, he was handicapped. So that's my family.
Any potential lawyers among the grandchildren?
I have there's one remote possibility, the one who just graduated from Rhodes, but he majored in Greco-Roman studies, and looks like he may end up as a Latin professor. I don't know. He still says I might decide to go to law school, but that's no potential lawyers.
After leaving, after Colonel Canada's death, where did you go in your law career at that time?
I went with Mr. R. Bartels, and he just allowed me to park in his office without paying rent. And I helped him on certain matters to pay for my rent, and then I had my own law practice. And I was very fortunate in that I got a case. It was a wrongful death case. I mean, it was a workman's comp death case, and I succeeded in getting the maximum payment of $10,000, and I got a $2,000 fee, which was really like manna from heaven in those days. But after about a year there, I had an offer from a firm. It was a tax boutique to come and try their tax cases. They had a lot of tax, you might say, contested tax matters, and they didn't have any people that, of course, I wasn't all that much of a trial lawyer, but I had done. At County Russell Turner, they had a lot of trial work, and they had a lot of junk, and I had done a whole lot of that. And then when I was out on my own, I tried anything I could get my hands on, so to speak. And I had even spent 6 weeks or so as a divorce proctor one time, where you get to sit in on all divorce cases. But so I'd had some experience, but they wanted somebody to try their tax cases. And so for the next 10 years, I tried tax cases, and I became a tax expert, you might say, from the back door.
What was the name of the firm that asked you to try tax cases?
Snowden Davis. Mm-hmm. And then it became Snowden Davis, Brown, and McCloy, and then finally Snowden Davis, Brown, and McCloy, and Donaldson.
So how many years were you a partner with that firm?
Well, I was a partner of that. I went with them in '45, and I left them in October of '54.
And what did you do when you left in October of '54?
I opened my own office, and by that time I had gotten a good bit of business, shall we say.
Now, when you opened your own office in 1954, did you have a partner with you?
Yeah, Ben Adams Sr. was my partner, and he had been an associate with Snowden Davis. Alan Davis, with whom I worked for the first 5 years, I went with him in '45. He died in July of '49, and I worked very closely with him for those 4 years, and he got me to be more and more of a tax person. And I was very fortunate in that he had apparently told all of his clients that something happened to me. And of course, he had not told me he was having heart trouble, but but apparently he was aware of some of his problems, and if something happens to me, go to Louis. So I was 31 years old, and I had a lot of business. A lot of business. Told my wife, I said, now, hon, I said, this is a chance of a lifetime. I've got to hold this business. And said, I'll see you in about 10 years. She said, it's the longest 10 years anyone ever endured. It's now pushing 50, but.
So this firm that you and Ben Adams Sr. put together in '54 was the predecessor of where we sit today,
that's
the
right.
Baker
That's
Donaldson
right.
firm.
That's right. And in '64, by that time we had about 12 or 15 lawyers. First National Bank of Memphis then, Renofri Turner asked me to become general counsel for the outside counsel for the bank. And well, after some protracted negotiations, and I think about that, how brash I was in those days. I guess I was still brash, but I was brash in those days. I said to Norfolk, who was, well, let's see, his wife was a distant cousin of our family. Of course, the Donaldsons are kin to everybody in Tennessee, you know, virtually. Been here more than 4 generations, at least. Distant cousin of ours, and a long time, Sam Ragland was Norfleet's father-in-law, and Mrs. Turner was, of course, family friend and all that sort of thing. And her older sister had dated my father. But in any event, and my grandfather had been a director of First National Bank. I don't know that had anything to do with it at all, but when I first talked to Norfleet, I said, well, how much are you paying him? And he told me, and I said, it's amazing, I hardly can say, I have nerve enough to say this. I said, Norfleet, I don't have any desire to subsidize the First National Bank. And he said, what do you mean? I said, that's totally inadequate. And I'm just not interested. And so we broke off conversations, and in 2 or 3 weeks he called me back. I guess he talked to some other lawyers, and they told him the same thing. But in any event, he called me back, and we worked out this unbelievable deal where he increased the retainer somewhat. And then he said, at the end of the year, you come down and we'll fix the fee. And I would go down every year, and we'd spend darn near a whole day arguing over the fee. And all of my partners, of course, all of my partners that had been with the old high school firm, you know, Longstreet and Ernest Williams and Bill Kirsch, they were scared to death of Norfolk Turner. None of them, I invited them to come to the meeting. None of them wanted to, oh, no, you go to the meeting. Anyway, so that was and when that, of course, gives a lot of emphasis from which to build the firm. And what Norfolk told me at the time was, we want to expand the bank. We want to buy other banks. And what we really want you to do is to help us buy other banks and to negotiate those deals and to handle legal work on those deals and that sort of thing. And we're perfectly satisfied with the Williams, doing our loan documents and some of our collection work, but we don't think they will do this other work. And that's sort of how I got the business, really, to do that. But that became the basis of the firm growing.
You told Mrs. Donaldson that you work hard to keep the business. Apparently you've kept the business.
Well, a lot of it. I lost some of it. You do lose it, Bill. You sure know that. You're old enough to know. People have sons coming on that don't come with your law firm, or they daughters marry lawyers, or whatever, and clients die. And then, of course, I've sold a lot of my clients.
Mr. Donaldson, I want to switch the focus a little bit. We started off the discussions about your heritage of public service and about the great stories you learned as a child. And my understanding is about the same time you were building this law firm in the mid-50s, you were also entering your public life as well. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, more or less. I got involved with, first I was on the Travelers Aid Board, and then I became president of Travelers Aid, and then I went on the...
And tell us what Travelers Aid is.
It's a charity that helps people who are, in trouble traveling on the road, and their car breaks down, or they lose their money, or somebody steals their money, and helps them to get home and all that sort of thing. And then I began to get involved with what we used to call Shelby United Neighbors, and I was on the budget committee, and then chairman of the budget committee, and then went up through the vice president, and now president of Shelby United Neighbors. Did all that sort of civic work, and then I went on the board at Southwestern, and did all that sort of stuff. But in 1952, it's a great story. I was at a cocktail party, and I don't drink, but I do sound off at cocktail parties. And I was sounding off about the fact that the Democrat Party had gone off and left us, and that even Mr. Crump knew that, and he had, backed Strom Thurmond and so on and so forth, and that they'd now repealed the 2/3 rule, and we didn't even have a veto power over the presidential candidate, and besides, the party was captured by the labor unions and so on and so forth. This, the standard line that you might well imagine. From
Were you a Democrat at the time?
I assumed I'd voted for Roosevelt several times.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether it's 2 or 3, but it was anyway. I had voted. I had voted for Dewey in '48. Well, this was in the spring of '52, and Eisenhower. Well, I guess it may have been in the fall of '51. I don't know. Anyway, the next day, this guy named Alan Redd, who was at the cocktail party, I remember meeting him. I had never known him before. Called me and said, "Louis, you ought to be a Republican." And I said, "Man," I said, "I'm like Andrew Jackson's great-great-grandson." I said, "That's a big move for me to make." He said, "Well, you talk like a Republican." And so then he gave me this big pitch that sort of took off from where I ended up by saying what you have in the South now is this one-party system that really occurs because you never get political races that involve issues. You get political races that involve personalities. And in the end, you don't get the same quality, you don't have the competition, and so on and so forth. To make a long story short, he talked me into joining with him to, the first thing we did was go down and try to attend a meeting of the Republican convention, and Lieutenant Lee was down there, and he got there early, and he locked the doors, and we all, Harry Welford and Bob James and Tom Turley and Alex Dan, we were all locked out in the hall, which made us that helped us to encourage us.
Let me just interrupt for just a second, Mr. Donaldson. Tell our viewers who Lieutenant Lee was.
Lieutenant Lee, his name was George Washington Lee. He was one of the, I don't know, there were less than 5 anyway, officers, black officers in the World War I, and he was one of them. And so he was always known thereafter as Lieutenant Lee. He was represented Atlanta Life Insurance Company here, and sold, nickel a week insurance and that sort of thing. And had been, he had been sort of a protege of Bob Church. And Bob Church Bob Church Sr. was the one who bought the bonds when Memphis went bankrupt. He was a black man who had been a steward on the river and made a lot of money and started a bank and so on and so forth. It was very successful, the first black millionaire in the South. And his son, they were all Republicans because, of course, all the blacks were Republicans because of Lincoln. And Lieutenant Lee was was Bob Church Jr.'s protege, and had sort of taken over the black political machine, which was Republican. In Memphis, that machine was very, might say, frail, because Mr. Crump had long since learned that voting blacks was a very good thing. And so he voted blacks, and they all voted in the Democrat primary, and then in the fall, some of them voted for the Republican in the general election. But that was the rule, and so Lieutenant Lee was hand in glove with Congressman Reese and Guy Smith, who was sort of running the Republican Party from East Tennessee, and that's who he was. And to our surprise, naive like we were, we discovered that they didn't want us in the Republican Party. We were,
and us were you and Harry Welford, Judge Welford,
and Newton Allen,
Alex Dan,
Leo Buchanani, a bunch of young Turks, most of us lawyers, and but there was a young guy named Arch McClure who was with Quaker Oats, and he was he was a Republican before he came down. And there were a bunch of not a bunch, but there were several other Northerners who had come down who joined in and became Republicans and helped us get started. Arch ran for Congress with us one time, but went on to be president of Quaker Oats.
So Lieutenant Lee locked you out of the first Republican meeting you tried to attend?
We all went to.
Why do you think Lieutenant Lee didn't want you?
Because we had a bigger crowd than he did. He was caught by surprise. Mm-hmm. And what we proved after that was we could raise a bigger crowd than he could every time. Mm-hmm. But we battled over it. Fascinating thing happened in 54, in the race for the state executive committee. We ran a full slate, and the way the ballot set up, while Lieutenant Lee's name was here, and Tom Turley's name was under his, and then Helen Allen's name was under that, and Jan Donaldson's name was under that, and then over on the other side were Billy Moody and Mrs. Dorman, I forgot, some black lady. Anyway, well, all the blacks thought that people under Lieutenant Lee's name were his candidates.
Mm-hmm. So that was the slate.
That was the slate. So he got elected, and so did our 3 slates underneath him. And so we then suddenly had 3 places on the state executive committee. And we really drove them crazy because we wanted to build the party and all. And gradually we got supporters. Got some people in Nashville, four members of the committee in Nashville, and then we got some from Henderson County, Lexington, and which is the only county that that Cal Reese carried when he ran against Tefall in West Tennessee.
Cal Reese was the congressman Republican congressman from East Tennessee, who ran against Senator Kefauver for the United States Senate.
And anyway, so it was a Republican county, And so we gradually began to build, and finally in '64 we got control of the state party, and that's how. But we had run people for office every time. We'd run some people for Congress. One of my better stories is we came out of a meeting, we were trying to get somebody to run for Congress, and somebody said, I'd say green with the reporters, and somebody said, well, Louis, why don't you run? And I said, man, I'm afraid I might win. And the next day it's in the paper, But I've learned to be a little more circumspect. But in any event, we had a wonderful time. It was a wonderful group of people. And what we did, an interesting situation happened because no business people wanted to touch us. Mr. Crump was still alive, and even after he died, the machine was still strong, and everybody was afraid to do that. We did get Dick Trapia, who'd come here from the north, admit to being a Republican. And
Dick Trapeer was
head of Euclid Machinery and handled road machinery and that sort of thing, very successful. His son was later president of Union Planters Bank, and we had a few, but most business people wouldn't touch us with a 10-foot pole. So in order to build the party, we went around and built it, I'd say on a precinct basis. My wife and Elise Turley and Helen Allen and and Mimi Dan and all that that group of, and they'd call somebody in the neighborhood and they'd have a party and they'd go down and give them a pitch about why we needed a two-party system and so on and so forth, and we began to build a precinct organization, which was really an amazing way, so different from Nashville where everything came down from the top. Mm-hmm. And so they still have no real base of support in Nashville other than financial. They give all the money and none of the votes. But down here it was started from little people. Mm-hmm. And that we just convinced that, that Mr. Crump was that time, mostly was that time gone. Nobody was really knew enough to be afraid of him. The business people knew all what to do, but that's how it kind of built.
Now, there were a lot of young men that emerged in the Republican Party in the 1960s. A dentist here named Winfield Dunn, a lawyer from East Tennessee named Howard Baker. And were you involved in the recruiting of these?
Yeah, very much involved in recruiting of those people. Because I'd been involved in recruiting everybody we ever had that ran. We formed something when we couldn't get control of the official party. We formed something called the Republican Association, and I was president of it, I think, during its whole existence. But anyway, for 5 or 6 years. And so that was part of my job, was recruiting people and so on and so forth. And Winfield had we recruited him to run for legislature. And he ran twice and got whipped.
This would have been in the late 50s, early 60s?
No, it was in 62 and 64, I
okay.
believe. And in 62, Bob James came within 900 votes of winning the congressional seat.
And this was running against Clifford Davis?
Cliff Davis.
He'd been there for decades.
Yeah, for a long time. Mm-hmm. And whose only accomplishment was to get shot by the Puerto Ricans. Delightful guy. But
this was when the attack on Congress in the late 40s.
Congress, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then in 64, Kirkendall ran against Gore for the Senate.
This is Dan Kirkendall.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then Kefauver died, and Howard Baker got in the race late and ran. And I ran both those. Well, I went to see Howard and got him to run, committee of 3 of us. And he did extremely well in the race. Dan didn't
in the 64 race
64
against...
race. I think he lost by 60,000 votes, which was viewed as a miracle. And but it told us something, that if we could get strong vote in Memphis, with the strong vote we had in the first 3 districts, because Brock had become congressman in the 3rd district by that time, we had a viable base. And so in 66, Howard ran again for the Senate, and ran against Clement. I guess that's right. And Kirkendall ran for Congress and won.
So 66 was a big year for Republican Party in Tennessee.
That's right.
And your role in Senator Baker's campaign was?
Well, the first year when I ran both Senate campaigns, mm-hmm. because I'd already started the Kirkendall campaign in 64, and I just took over the Baker campaign, because Howard knew a whole lot more about campaigning than any of us, because he's braved in politics. But nonetheless, I did both campaigns that year. We had no other. And of course, in those days, everybody was a volunteer. We hadn't, we may have had 1 paid employee. I don't believe in 64 we had any paid employees. had no money.
Now, you said a moment ago that people asked you to run for public office, and you said you weren't going to do that. But in 1967, you reconsidered, correct?
Well, sort of. And, you know, we got a big head of steam up about changing the form of city government.
In Memphis.
In about 66. And Commercial Appeal came up with this idea we'd have a town hall meeting and elect a charter commission, because the city commission would not elect a charter commission. And so I went down to that meeting and got myself elected as one of the members of the charter commission. And we came up with a charter, and then by that time the Commercial Appeal had given us so much publicity and built up such a big head of steam that the commission could not resist the pressure to submit the charter to the voters, and they voted and approved it. So then we had a new form of government. And following my usual duties, I was appointed the committee to recruit candidates. And so I recruited a number of candidates, and Gwen Awesome was one, and Phil Perrell was another, and Downing Pryor was another one, and Bob James, who said that they would run, and Tom Todd, they would run if I would. And finally, didn't have anybody saying they'd run if I didn't, and so I finally said, y'all are covered. Now nobody can back out, because I'm going to run. So I ran, and I said it'd be one term.
So you served one term on the Memphis City Council.
That's right, one term.
Now, I've been told by a very reliable source that during the '67 campaign that an issue came up that shockingly still comes up, and that was the question of tax increases. And were you asked about your position on that?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I had there were 26 of us who were in the runoff, and so they went around and asked a question. Each person answered the question. Would you vote for a tax increase? 25 no's and 1 yes. And as I told Bill, I ended up getting more votes than anybody. And so it's, of course, maybe it wasn't quite as hot an issue as those days, but it does show the instinct of politicians to say what people want to hear. But it also shows that when you tell the truth, people do appreciate it.
After your one term on the city council, you remained active in Republican politics. What was the next?
Well, of course, I was very much involved while I was on the city council in the Dunn election.
This is Governor Dunn's election in 1970.
1970. Very much involved, and and then I really became Dunn's principal, you might say, unofficial advisor. I developed his first budget, and without mentioning the name of his commission of F&A, my secretary called him Dr. Pepper, because he was an old lad, and Dr. Pepper, you know, Dr. Pepper at 10, 2, and 4. And he said, the commissioner called you every day at 10, 2, and 4. So I was commissioner, you know, one step removed. But so I was very much involved in the Dunn administration. Went up there all the time and was very much involved with Winfield at that time. And I was not as involved in Alexander's campaign when he ran and lost against Planton, because I was running campaign for Kirkendall, and I was also running some other statewide campaigns that I was involved in. So I didn't get involved in the Lamar's campaign. But then I stayed active of course, when Lamar was elected in 78, he asked me to become commissioner of F&A, and I agreed.
Now, I want to ask you about your years as Commissioner of Finance and Administration, but before that, Mr. Donaldson, I want to talk to you about a specific historical moment in Tennessee's history, and that was, I don't know how else to phrase this, as I understand, Governor Alexander took office a little bit earlier than was scheduled.
That's right.
And you were part of that.
That's right. I was out with Lamont. We were discussing the budget and other issues, including finishing up the cabinet and so on and so forth.
This was after Governor Alexander had been elected, but before he
And
took office.
It was in early January. I say early January. It was just a few days before he was to take office. And the U.S. Attorney, Haltom, called us. And he said, we've just received word that Blanton is going to make 30 more pardons before he leaves office.
That was Governor Ray Blanton.
Governor Ray Blanton.
The outgoing governor at the time.
And we think you ought to be sworn in early. And so Lamar puts me on the phone, and I talked to Hal, and I said, Hal, have you talked to, it was interesting about those things. I was so much more sophisticated about these things than Republicans were because they'd never been in office. So I don't know, anyway. I said, have you talked to the two speakers? Oh, yes. And
this would have been Governor Wilder
and Governor and Speaker McWhorter. Speaker McWhorter and Governor Wilder. And so we hung up the phone, and Lamar said, what should I do? I said, the first thing you should do is you should call the two speakers and tell them that if they want you to do it, and they are supporting the U.S. Attorney's request, that you will do it. And so he said, well, you call them, because I knew them both. McWhorter was my client, and had been for a number of years. Wilder was my longtime friend. And so I called them both, and they said, that's right. We've talked to Hal. We've talked to General Leach, who was then Attorney General. We both think that ought to be done. And I said, well, you will come and attend. Oh,
what
yes.
ought to be done is to swear in Lamar Alexander as governor
that day.
That day.
That day. And so we all on the phone, and they said, well, now we ought to get Chief Justice Henry to swear you in. Well, no. Well, I said, well, I know him fairly well, but I said, Louis, why don't you go down and ask him to do this? So I ended up being the one that everybody agreed ought to go down and see Justice. And I went down in person and said, it couldn't have been nice, and said, of course I'll do it. And so we went down, and that afternoon, about 5 o'clock, where he was sworn in with the press president and the Attorney General and the two speakers and a few other people, including some members of his family.
Now, how much earlier?
It was about 4 days. That was Wednesday.
4 days before he was.
That was Wednesday. He's going to be sworn in Saturday morning.
And I understand the emergency basis was the concern by the
About
U.S.
the
Attorney that Governor Blanton was
going to be issued.
having a clearance sale in it.
So then the FBI guy comes and he says to me, Lamar said, you need to go and secure the Capitol. And Lamar said, what do you mean? He said, well, we don't want anybody to take anything out of the building. And so this is the beginning of what I did when I was Commissioner of FNA, all dirty jobs. So I said, Louis, you go and do that. So I go down there, and I claimed to know a lot about state government. I didn't realize that the Capitol Police and the state troopers were different. So this Capitol policeman down there, went on, and he looked like a retired shoe clerk. And I said, we got to secure the Capitol. And he looked at me like I'd said, the Russians. I said, I think we're going to need some help. And I called your boss. Well, when I got his boss, I realized that he wasn't the head of the safety, the highway department. I mean, the safety department. And he, so I said, well, I really want to talk to the head of the highway department. So I got him, and I said, I want you to send troopers over. Well, I had two troopers, Paul Lane and Johnny White, that I'd known extremely well when Winfield was governor. They'd been assigned to Winfield, and they looked after me frequently. And so I called for them, and they said we'd get them both, and they sent them on over there. And so then we secured the Capitol. And one of the little funny things is, of course, I called my wife and said, well, I won't be home for dinner, honey. I'm going to secure the Capitol. She said, you've made a lot of sorry excuses, but this is the best one I've ever heard. But anyway, I go down and secure the Capitol, and then Jan tells me they're announcing, we understand that Commissioner Donaldson has nailed up the back door of the governor's office. And she said to herself, I know that's a lie because Louis couldn't nail up anything. But anyway, sure enough, the governor's council calls me and says, they tell me I can't take anything out of the building. I said, that's right. I said, well, I want to take some papers to Governor Blanton. I said, well, he's not governor anymore. And I said, FBI's here and the troopers are here and nobody's taking anything out of the building. He said, well, I've just got these papers. You can. I said, I'll come down there. So I went down there and he said, well, there they are. I said, 28 pardons and commutations stacked up there, all ready to be signed. I mean, it wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a rumor. And I said, well, you can't take them out of the building. He said, well, you do it. I said, I want to look at them. I said, you can't take anything out of the building. And that's it, period. So he said, well, I'm going to call Governor Blanton. So he calls Blanton. Blanton's in the shower.
Blanton's at the governor's mansion.
Yeah, at the mansion, governor's mansion. And so we sit there staring at each other. And finally he said, well, I think I've done my duty. I'm going to leave. When he gets up and he gets just to the door, the phone rings, and it's Blanton. And he said, Governor Blanton, says, some guy down here says his name is Louis Donaldson, tells me I can't take anything out of the building. And so Blanton said, well, you put him on. Well, I knew Blanton. You'll appreciate this, Bill. When Blanton proposed an income tax, he couldn't get anybody to advocate it. So he called me and asked me if I would come up and advocate the income tax, which I did. Didn't do any good, but I did. Advocated Blanton's income tax. So I knew him. I had some other dealings with him. And he said, well, let me see, well, suppose I come down there. I said, well, Governor, I said, I won't let you in the building. The building's closed. He said, the building's closed to the public? I said, well, it's closed every night, Governor. I thought to myself, I don't know, he had been spending a lot of time there. But anyway, he said, then we get this argument about whether he's still governor. I'm supposed to have a 4-year term, and I haven't served for 4 years, so on and so forth. Actually, his term the 4 years would have expired on Friday. And I said, well, no, I just tell you this much, that the Attorney General was present when we swore Alexander in, the 2 speakers were present when we swore Alexander, and the Chief Justice swore him in. And he said, well, what am I going to tell the press? And I said, well, you just tell the press that you're no longer governor. And he said, oh, I can't do that. And so we had to, I said, well, tell him that the Attorney General called you. I heard him call you, tell you you're no longer governor. And he said, well, he keeps saying, he said, I said, I'll tell you what you do, Governor. I said, you just tell him that I called you and I told you you were no longer governor. He said, okay, that's all right. So that was it.
So there was no effort by Governor Blanton or his council to resist this in any fashion?
There was no legal effort of any kind to resist it. Mm-hmm. And there was some papers taken out of the governor's office during that day, but apparently nothing of any significance.
Did you have any contact with Governor Blanton after he left office?
One, he called me a couple of days later and said, can I come and get my desk? Which they gave me when I left Congress. And I said, yes. But I have some contact with him now. His son lives 2 doors from me.
Oh, really? Okay. So you maintain a cordial relationship?
Very nice. He's a nice young man.
So you and Governor Alexander both went into office a few days early.
That's right.
He as governor and you as Commissioner of Finance and Administration.
Right. Exactly.
And you served in that position for how many years?
2.5 years. What Lamar promised me if I would come was that I would be Chief Operating Officer for the state. and all cabinet members would report to me, and I supervised everything. It was wonderful fun. I worked 80 hours a week, but it was wonderful fun. And in the beginning, a few cabinet members appealed to the governor, but after a few appeals, there were no further appeals. And Lamar and I met every morning. Lamar really knew what a governor should do, which was to plan what he wanted done, to decide how he was going to sell that to the public, to decide how he was going to sell that to the legislature. And of course, I was his chief emissary to the legislature, primarily because of my close personal relationships with McWilder and McWhirter, which I just didn't visualize how important that would be. Because both of them said to all their Democrats, you know, this is the guy that's going to tell you the truth, and you can depend on it. And it made it harder for me because I had to be sure I did, but it also gave me a lot of ability to deal with it. But Lamar really knew what a governor should do. He planned what he wanted to do. He studied the issues. He developed a careful plan. Then he would go around the state and sell people on the idea to build up public support for it. He was extremely skillful in knowing what a chief executive to do. And he made the decisions, and I ran the details.
Now, Governor Alexander was a very young man when he
was young enough to be my son, right?
How old was he when he became governor?
38.
And what was your relationship like working for the governor, who was so
It was
young?
wonderful. I mean, it was wonderful.
Any particular challenges of working for a man that young?
No. As I said, he was extremely smart, but he was also had something that is unfortunately a little bit rare among politicians. He was not threatened by people who were smart. He told me when I left, he said, no, everybody told me that I shouldn't get you. You were too smart and you were too hard-headed. And I said, no, you've been a lawyer all this time. You know what representing a client is, and you'll represent me. And I remember one time McWhirter busted at me. He said, now, Louis, you know you don't believe that. And he said, well, I'm not going to say whether I believe that or not, but I'll tell you one thing. When Lamar tells me to shoot somebody, I shoot him. So anyway, we had a wonderful relationship. And it was just, it couldn't have been nicer. And it was particularly wonderful in the sense that he had a lot of teasing.
He had a lot of what? I'm sorry.
Teasing about the fact that I was governor.
I see. Okay.
A lot of teasing. And one story that he loved and I loved too. I'm down in Texas, first vacation I'd taken, and I called him, talked to him about something, and you know how it is in those days, particularly going through the operator, and I finally got the Capitol, and they said the governor's at the mansion, and I got the mansion, and the governor's, you know, I talked to the trooper, and so on and so on. And finally the operator gets Lamar on the phone, and she says, Mr. Alexander, Governor Donaldson is calling. Lamar said, quick as a flash, don't tell me the news has already gotten to Texas. But anyway, we had a wonderful relationship. And he told me when I left, he said, you know, I can't think of a single time when you did something that I wish you had told me about before you did it. And he said, I can think of a whole lot of times, and I was glad you had done something and you hadn't told me about it before you did it. So it couldn't have been a better relationship.
Well, you left after 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to leave at that time?
Well, I told him I'd give him 3 legislatures. And the Commissioner of F&A, you know, he was extremely powerful. I don't think they do this anymore, but they had the habit in those days, and they did a lot with me. They would pass things subject to the approval of the Commissioner of F&A. No veto, no override. If I knocked it out, it was knocked out. Really very interesting.
You had a good working relationship with the legislature in those
Had a
days.
very good relationship with the legislature. Doug Henry, I got along well with him, and guy from Murfreesboro, who was chairman of House Finance Ways and Means. Senior moment. Anyway, we got along extremely well.
Yeah, yeah.
And
John Rucker, was it?
no, he's a senator.
Okay. Anyway, you had a good relationship with the legislature.
Very, very good relationship. They had a lot of, I got along well with them.
Do you think it's obviously right now, June 26, 2002, headlines in this morning's paper of the Governor Sundquist referred to our current situation in Tennessee as maybe the greatest crisis since the Civil War in state government in Tennessee. What do you think's changed in the 20 years since you and Governor Alexander had a good relationship with the Democratic legislature?
Well, and of course, actually, Sundquist doesn't have a bad relationship with the Democratic legislature. That part hadn't changed all that much. Sundquist doesn't have a very good relationship with the Republicans. It's partly a growing anti-tax and anti-government feeling. It's been fed in Tennessee by talk radio, which. And it's produced a situation. Of course, one of the things, this is sort of a personal thing, but see, two Republicans that I convinced we ought to have an income tax were Atlanta Donaldson and David Copeland. They both promptly got beat. So that's a part of the legend up there. You know, don't let Louis talk you into an income tax, because that's a sure way to get beat. So that's some of the problem. But also, it's talking the reliance on polls, the taking of polls is so much greater, and polls are the curse of modern politics. They really are. I mean, what is a poll? A poll is the offhand opinion of somebody who knows nothing about the question. I mean, that's what it is, and it really is a disturbing situation. When you take a poll, you know, and you really put in all the factors that are facing the people, it'll run, you know, counting the fact that the person taking it is probably leaning towards an income tax, they frequently run more than 50% in favor of it. So sure, if you call up and say, do you want an income tax? Most people can say, hell no. I mean, I think about it, what I pay in the federal government, that's enough. And that's the kind of situation you get. So that's the polls are part of the problem. The anti-government attitude is part of the problem, and the fact that it seems to be now that the way you get elected is by telling people what they want to hear.
I heard you make a speech several years ago when I was in an audience in a group called Leadership Memphis, and you made the statement in that speech that you would never vote for anyone who ran on a campaign platform that under no circumstances would they ever vote for any tax increases.
That's right. Because what he says is he doesn't want to govern. I'm going to go up there and block government. I'm not going to govern. That's what he's saying. And the whole lot, Jimmy Nafee told me, Jimmy Nafee is the Speaker of the House. Jimmy Nafee told me that last year, he had 30 members of his House come to him. Majority of them Republicans, but substantial number of them Democrats. Say, I won't vote for a cut or a tax increase.
Either one.
Either one. And he said, what the hell are you doing here? And yet that's the attitude that's up there right today. They won't vote for either one. And it's just disturbing. There are people out there that have spent so long talking about how much they're against government that when they get in, they have, it's not so much what they promise, that's part of what it is, but their mindset is such they can't govern. They can't vote for doing anything that we need doing. And, you know, here we are in a state that they're just right at rock bottom in education. And everyone knows that education is the only way that a citizen is going to succeed in the 21st century. I mean, it just, you know, the guys that came out of the 8th grade and made successes in the 20th century, there won't be any of those anymore. It's just not that possible anymore. And now there may be some that go out and educate themselves, but and yet here we are, you know, talking about and they say, I don't want to give any more money to those sorry schools. I said, well, if you want to be sorry, you found the right solution. And it's really a troubling problem. And what it is you know, that we don't have people that are out there providing the kind of leadership that we ought to be getting on that, so that people really know the truth. And of course, because there are people out there that, you know, they want to hear what they want to hear, but they will listen to the truth. They will listen to the truth, and it's just, you know, it's just a sad situation. And you know, of the people who voted for the income tax in 2000, in the year 2000, and that is, who voted out of the committee that year, only one person was defeated. And she was a woman from Memphis who had a whole lot of baggage. She was a Republican, had a whole lot of baggage. I think she's probably a very able representative, but she was a pushy broad, shall we say. And some people, you know, and she got beat in the Republican primary. She could have probably won in the general election. Probably should have run as an independent. But in any event, that's only one person lost. So I think that people are gradually realizing that we need to change something. And of course, I know, I mean, way more than 50% of the House and Senate have told me personally that they know that the income tax is the right thing to do. And it needs to be done, but I can't vote for it. Not all the 50, but some of the key ones. And some of them are close friends of mine.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of your state?
I'm optimistic about the long-range future. I'm optimistic about the long-range future. I'm an optimist. I wouldn't have started my own firm, you know, if I wasn't an optimist. But I'm pessimistic right now about the immediate future. The old saying goes, things sometimes have to get worse before they get better. And it may be that, I don't know how they can get much worse, but the dog's budget would be worse.
You've been practicing now 62?
Well, not practicing. I passed the bar 62 years ago. I actually started practicing in 43, so it'll be 59 years. It is 59 years this month.
And since leaving the position of F&A, as you say, you've been involved in very interesting cases about Tennessee policy, like the small schools case.
Yeah, I've been involved in the small schools case, and it's still ongoing. Just argued the third phase of it in May before the Supreme Court.
Where do you see your practice going in the future? Will you continue to be involved in these types of cases?
Yes, I probably will. As a matter of fact, if they adopt the dog's budget, I think I'll probably be suing them again. At least some people have been talking to me about it. And of course, I've got a case up in Gibson County, a school case up there that's somewhat similar issues. And, so I tend to get involved in that kind of thing now. But I still do some tax planning and some corporate advising and things and that sort of thing.
Looking back on 62 years since you passed the bar, what have you enjoyed most about being a lawyer?
Well, in retrospect, what I've enjoyed most is the diverse things that I've been involved in. I've gotten to know a lot about a whole lot of different businesses, not just banks, but other. You know, I had a chicken processing client. I learned a whole lot about the chicken processing business. I had a client that was in the automotive parts business. We got into a big case with in which General Motors was involved in a federal trade violation, and made some new law on what you could do about discounts and selling automobile parts. I've represented automobile dealers. I've represented farmers, and right now I'm representing a company that owns already a family company that owns a whole lot of timber. I'm learning about the timber business and all, and that's been fascinating to me. Unfortunately, since about 60, I have not been in court as much, and I haven't had the the association with other lawyers that you would have. I've had a lot of association with lawyers in my own firm, but not today, which is a nice thing and a major plus back in the days when I was in court all the time and you saw other lawyers, and that's that's a good thing. I find the law essentially very stimulating, and I never have had any desire to be a judge. I like the adversarial nature.
Anything else you'd like to do in your practice?
Well, I've got a matter right now in which I've got not going very well. We've got a huge contingent fee. I can't help wishing that I could pull that off. But no, I don't know of anything else that I'd like to do in my practice. I've had an extremely rewarding career, and I built a big law firm, and people say, why isn't your name first, because you're older than Howard? I said, because I haven't been majority leader in the Senate, and I haven't been chief of staff in the White House. I've done a lot of other things, but not that. But the firm is my firm, and I built it, and Howard came with us after his firm got in financial trouble, but he got into difficulties, and I talked to him about joining together, and I called him and I said, now's the time. And he said, that's right. So we put the two firms together, and that's been very successful. People used to say, why don't you have a Washington office? I said, because I haven't got Howard Baker. When I get him, I'll have my Washington office. And so I've had all those successes. I've got offices all over Tennessee, and we've got good lawyers, and we do, I think, good work. Started out to try to build a firm that could do well most anything that a business needed. And we've not quite got that done, but we've come pretty close. We got some white-collar crime people now. That's the last thing we got on board. But we are now dealing with the problems of intellectual property and that sort of thing, which is a new area. We've got a couple of young guys that are doing that. So we've been trying constantly to stay ahead of the game. We've got a big healthcare practice, which has been extremely successful for us. Our Washington lobbying thing is considered among the top 10 in Washington, so we do that well too. So I've done most of what I do, but I don't want to quit because I still enjoy it.
Mr. Donaldson, thank you very much for your time. It's been a real privilege interviewing you.
I won't. And